Welcome to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio 1240 AM and 97.3 FM.
Good day, and thank you for joining us for the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I'm Deacon Jim Hoegemeier, a permanent deacon of the Diocese of Madison, assigned to All Saints Parish in Berlin. I also serve as Associate Director of the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities of the Diocese of Madison. We are joined by our host, the shepherd of our diocese, Bishop Donald Hying, the 5th Bishop of Madison. Welcome, Bishop Hying. It's wonderful to be with you again.
It's always great to be with you, Deacon Jim. Thank you.
And now this is our second show, so I'm assuming that the ratings from last week went right through the steeple, so they invited us back again.
It's always great to have a second chance, right?
So are you still settling in with your new role?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm doing a lot of things for the first time. I did a Mass at Camp Gray this week. I had the Mass for marriage anniversaries. I've met with the principals, so a lot of first-time events, but all of it's been great. Everybody's remarkably kind.
Well, I know you and I had talked about some possible topics, things we'd like to talk about, and one thing we'd kind of focus on is we're trying to select topics that all of us might have a little bit of familiarity with, but we may not realize the impact that some of these things might have in our lives as Catholic, the relevance that it has to our lives as Catholics in the Diocese of Madison. One thing I was thinking about was Episcopal conferences, which is, people think, well, is that a meeting of bishops? If you call me to your office, is that an Episcopal conference? But really, we may know of them. It's basically a grouping of bishops in an area. And the one that most of us have likely heard of is rightly named the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, which is the Episcopal Conference of the United States. So I just ask you, given your experience now as a veteran bishop, in a nutshell, what is the USCCB?
Yeah, most people think of the Vatican or our local diocese, and we don't often think of the church kind of on the national level. So in canon law, every bishop reports directly to the Holy See, directly to the Holy Father. But I think almost all the countries of the world have a national bishops' conference. And it's really a way for the bishops of a particular country to come together, to speak with one voice, to have a role vis-a-vis the government, to organize works of charity, and to exercise really the teaching office of the bishop in a collegial way. So obviously, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops is a significant voice in our country, not only for the church, but really for our government and for our society at large. Its history is fascinating. It really began after World War I as the Catholic Welfare Conference, and it was a way to respond to the desperate needs of so many refugees and suffering people because of the war. And it's gone through a few evolutions of being, and today it has a significant number of staff, a great number of offices and committees, a very elaborate structure, but it really helps to organize the church on the national level, and it's a very significant body of influence.
So it's made up of the bishops of the United States. So when you were ordained auxiliary bishop in the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, does every bishop automatically become a member of the USCCB?
You do become a member just by the fact that you are a bishop. So there's usually 2 meetings a year, one in June, and the location of that usually rotates, and then one in November, and those meetings are always in Baltimore. So the staff comes up from Washington. There's an agenda for all the various days. A lot of the work really is done on the committee level. So by the time an action item would come to the entire assembly, it's really been vetted, it's been tweaked, it's been articulated, and it really usually passes. So we discuss items of interest in terms of catechesis, liturgy, evangelization. So the conference votes on particular things such as liturgical texts. So it's a varied agenda.
And as a deliberative body, I'm assuming the leadership is also voted on by the bishop members.
Yes, so the bishops elect the president and the vice president of the conference. So currently it's Cardinal DiNardo of Galveston, Houston is the president, and the vice president is Archbishop Gomez of Los Angeles. And that there's obviously terms for all of that.
So then the question would be Cardinal DiNardo your boss or the boss in any way of the bishop members of the USCCB?
Yeah, canonically not. So individual bishop is not required to really necessarily follow all the stipulations or things voted on by the USCCB, because each bishop is responsible to the Holy See and to the Vatican. But it does mean that there's policies, there's procedures, there's things in place that it just makes sense for all of us to endorse and do this together.
What is the relationship between the USCCB and the Holy See? Because I know one in the recent meeting, they were talking about some issues, some plans related to handling procedures related to sexual abuse, and there was some dialogue, I know, going with timing and things between the USCCB and the Holy See. But I was just wondering if you could give us a little insight on in the connection, the relationship between our National Bishop Conference and the Holy See.
I'm sure I don't know enough to give a full answer, Deacon Jim, but I do know that the president and vice president give an annual report personally to the Holy Father regarding the Church in the United States and the work of the USCCB. Also, the papal nuncio, Archbishop Pierre, who's here recently in our diocese for the first time for my installation, would have a key role to play in that communication as well. So Holy See would certainly be in dialogue, in communication, and in conversation with the leadership of the Bishops' Conference of the States.
When the bishops do vote, whether it be for leadership or even on different proposals that might come before them as a body, do all of the bishops have a vote, even like auxiliaries, current ordinaries, and even perhaps retired bishops? And are their votes kind of equal?
It depends on what we're voting on. So I believe when it comes to example for changing a liturgical text, it's only the ordinaries or the bishops that are in charge of dioceses vote. Other matters, the auxiliaries can vote as well. The retired bishops can attend the meetings. They can get up and speak, but they can't vote.
Now, we talked a little bit before. You mentioned the Bishops' Conference having a pretty significant committee structure. What is the expectation of the bishop members in terms of their involvement in these committees? Is each basic member assigned to one or two or maybe more committees?
Yes, so really it's by invitation. Sometimes it's from the committee chair, or the committee chairs are elected by the body at large. So usually you're invited to come on board a particular committee, and sometimes we're elected to certain memberships by the regional meeting. So we're in Region 7 here in Wisconsin, which comprises Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. So Region 7 of the U.S. Bishops' Conference would be the bishops of those three states. So, for example, I serve on the Committee for Aid to Eastern Europe, which distributes needed funds for projects in formerly Soviet countries to rebuild the church there. I'm on the Committee for Catholic Education. I'm the National Chaplain for the St. Vincent de Paul Society. I'm the National Liaison for the National Association of Catholic Chaplains, and I'm on the Committee for Protecting God's Children.
So those are all assigned to you through the Bishops' Conference?
Yeah, so by invitation, right. Usually it's from the committee chair that would approach me and say, would you be willing to serve on this committee? Now,
you recently were on a trip, kind of under the auspices of one of the committees that you serve on, making a trip to Eastern Europe and Asia. Would you care to give us some details on that?
Yes, so the bishops that serve on this Committee for Aid to Eastern Europe are assigned particular countries to kind of gain an expertise on the projects that we sponsor in those countries and be a supportive presence. So occasionally we visit the countries that we're assigned to. So this summer, shortly after I was installed here, I went on a pre-planned trip to Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. So if you can picture where India is, these countries would be north of the Himalayas, north of India. At one point, I was 200 miles from the Western Chinese border. Catholics there constitute a very tiny, tiny minority, and most of the Catholics would be descendants of either German or Russian folks that had moved there, some in exile because of Stalin's purges, that sort of thing during the Soviet time, others because they would have been intellectuals and would have been sent there to teach. So really it was to be a supportive presence to the church, which is very small, but very committed, and also to see what are future projects that we can support in terms of literally rebuilding the church since communism collapsed in the early 90s. An interesting fact, one Sunday I was in Uzbekistan in July last month. The temperature was 51 degrees Celsius, which is 124 degrees Fahrenheit. So I will never, ever complain about it being hot again. It was amazing, but an amazing trip.
You're listening to the Diocese of Madison This Week on Relevant Radio. I'm Deacon Jim Hoegemeier, and we're having a discussion with Bishop Donald Hying, the Bishop of Madison, about Episcopal conferences, specifically the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. And in a few minutes, we'll maybe discuss about its state counterpart, the Wisconsin Catholic Conference. When we think about the National Bishops Conference, you mentioned the bishops and the various work of the committees. I would imagine that you kind of mentioned there's significant staff presence there must be at the Bishops Conference to basically make all this work and your work possible.
No, that's right. Especially when you look at the Committee for Catholic Education, for example, they vet all catechetical materials that are published in the United States. So just think of the volume of that, especially in light of the internet. So many things are not even published on paper anymore, but are sent out electronically. So U.S. Bishops Conference has the authority and the obligation to vet all catechetical materials that are put out on the national level. So you have that. You have political advocacy on the national level vis-a-vis Congress and the White House on legislative issues. You have the oversight of U.S. seminaries. You have all the national collections that fund and fuel our efforts in terms of foreign missions, in terms of the Catholic University, in terms of Catholic Relief Services. So it's an enormous enterprise when you think of all the different facets of the Church's mission.
So then obviously it takes some resources to make that possible. So how is the USCCB funded?
So part of it is through the national collections would come directly from the faithful and collections taken up in parishes. Many of the operational funds would come from the dioceses themselves. So just as every parish in our Diocese of Madison pays essentially a form of tax to fund the work of the diocese, so in turn every diocese pays a form of tax to fund the work of the USCCB.
So we've been focusing on the National Bishops Conference, but is there a counterpart at the state level?
So we call it the Wisconsin Catholic Conference, and 3 times a year the Wisconsin bishops come together to meet to discuss pastoral issues, things that are before us on a state level, to be supportive of each other, to learn what's going on in each other's dioceses. We also have, it's a very small staff, 2 or 3 people, but they work here in Madison, and they really work with our legislators on the state level to advance the Catholic perspective on particular bills and laws. So bills that we would be supportive of, bills that we would be against, other things that would probably just be neutral on. So obviously to advocate the Catholic perspective when it comes to the voice of the Church in the public square regarding so many dimensions of our common life that have a moral quality to them and a moral imperative.
I recently read some news came up recently. I know there's been legislation proposed in Wisconsin that could have an impact basically on the sacrament of reconciliation, which of course we have significant concerns about. And I know the Wisconsin Catholic Conference was taking a lead to the point that I know some of the media were contacting individual dioceses to get their comment, and they were referring the media, why don't you talk with the experts at the staff at the Wisconsin Catholic Conference? And
that's a good example of why it's helpful to have something like a state conference, because there's issues that we don't have to all speak out individually. We can have a unified voice, and we have staff that are sophisticated and savvy in terms of being able to articulate the Church's stance on particular issues and have ongoing relationships with our legislators to help advance bills or to oppose bills that really are not in the best interest of the common good.
When you were in Gary, I'm sure there was a similar counterpart, a state bishops conference for Indiana?
Yes, there's an Indiana State Conference. We'd go down to Indianapolis for the meetings.
Primarily focused on public policy, almost like ours. That's
exactly right. Yeah, so every state in the country, I believe, has a state conference as well.
Now, I can offer this as some relevance to how these bishops' conferences have impacted a couple of things that I'm involved with, even as a deacon, having gone through deacon formation. we went through a formation program that was based on guidelines developed by the USCCB, in fact, by a committee of which Bishop Morlino was the chair when these guidelines were being developed. But then also in my work with the Apostolate for Persons with Disabilities, it was the USCCB, I think then the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, as it was called, that way back in 1978, before it was even much talked about, came out with a pastoral statement on people with disabilities and their involvement with the church. So I think that's just two examples of where these bishop conferences, we might hear about them every once in a while, but they really do have an impact on the life of people in the pews.
They do, and it really helps us to speak with a unified voice on particular issues and to marshal resources where we don't all have to reinvent the wheel on the local level.
And a couple of things I maybe point out from my experience even before I was a deacon, especially with USCCB. You know, even now, things are gearing up for an election. We know that, even though the election's a national election is a ways off, but they have a document that they revise every election cycle, faithful citizenship, which is just truly a godsend for people that are, it can be difficult to figure out what choices can I make.
So how do we form our conscience, when it comes to voting, when it comes to participation in the political process, from the Catholic perspective?
I know even at the statewide level, the Wisconsin Catholic Conference has a Catholics at the Capitol event, I think every 2 years. I think it's at times with the legislative cycle, so we get the most bang from our buck by being present in the Capitol. But also, I know they offer, both organizations at the state level and the national level, offer online resources that can be very helpful. And one, I was power of attorney for both my parents at one time, and working with them, very devout Catholics, I made sure that we used the forms that the Wisconsin Catholic Conference developed for power of attorney with an addendum, a Catholic addendum for things like hydration and nutrition. In closing, any last comments on how these Episcopal conferences really influence the everyday lives of Catholics around the world, given your experience, but also especially here in Wisconsin and even in our own diocese?
Yeah, I think in just a lot of ways that we wouldn't immediately know unless you knew, right? So, in terms of legislation, in terms of catechetical texts, in terms of missions, in terms of supporting efforts to help the poor, healthcare, all of that, there's a dimension to that on the national and the state level.
Well, in wrapping up, we want to thank you, Bishop Hying, our host, for this wonderful conversation, and we look forward to many more of these opportunities. And stay tuned as Tim and Mary take a look at this week's Catholic Herald. You're listening to Relevant Radio.